I'm Pete McGarvey, and this is a first for our program series, the very first time we've had the pleasure of introducing a political cartoonist to you. And it's someone who needs no introduction. Andy Donato, Toronto Sun's stellar political cartoonist, has been there from day one of the Sun, and in fact came to the Sun along with a lot of telegrads, as I recall.
Bunch of ragtag.
Ragtag telegrads, yeah. That was what, 1971?
71, November the 1st, 1971. Yeah, it seems like a century ago to me right now.
The little paper that grew that nobody gave much of a chance to back then.
Nope, they all dumped on it and whatnot and said I would never make it, and we managed to survive.
Now, you had been doing some cartooning before that time, but this was really the start of...
Yeah, when I was at the telly, I did it at one time there. When Al Beaton died, I did it for 5 months, and then Bassett and Doug McFarlane didn't really like. I think it was mainly Doug didn't like my stuff, so they sent me back to my old job.
Why didn't they like it?
I don't know. I think, well, I think the thing was they gave you 3 months. You're on 3-month trial everywhere you go these days. Right. I went on 3-month trial. I was really green at politics and everything else. I mean, I knew a little about drawing, but and I could draw fairly well. I wasn't that big in caricature at the time. I hadn't really studied it. And I guess I just wasn't grasping what they wanted in a cartoonist. I think they had something else in mind. They wanted more of the family situation, you know, the mother, father talking to the kids type thing on events. And it wasn't my style of cartooning. Eventually, I would do it part-time, filling in. Then when the Sun started, I was again really doing it part-time only. I was doing 2 a week. We started the Sunday paper. I was doing 3 a week. Yardley Jones was still doing the other days. And then he ran off to the Montreal Star. And
so
I took over full-time. The Montreal Star went broke, and he went to the Edmonton. Right. He went to our Edmonton paper.
Now, the paper always marched to its own drummer. And I know from past conversations, Andy, that that's what they encouraged. They wanted you to do your thing in your way.
Yep.
As you saw it. You know, don't particularly pay attention to the editorial page or what other people were saying. Just how you felt about political situations, what your perception was.
Well, I think it was Worthington mainly who was the editor, and Peter, I guess I've always said that thank God I thought along the same lines as Peter. He had a tremendous influence on me in many ways. So I was safe there. I mean, if I had been a radical left-winger, I think I would have been in trouble from day one.
Well, nobody's going to mistake anybody at the Sun for being a radical left-winger,
right?
Now, it was also the time of Trudeau mania. And this guy was on the scene, and
well, he'd just gone through his first 3 years when we started.
That's right.
And we were beginning
he was
twig.
right. And what a delicious person to have as Prime Minister if you're a political cartoonist.
Oh, it was. Although, mind you, I was a great Trudeau supporter in '68. Thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And as time went on, I think the cracks began to show, and my philosophy began to change. And by the time we got up to the was the '72 election, and Stanfield almost won it. He became, you know, better to draw, and I guess by that time I was sort of against everything he did, so it was wonderful.
Well,
you know.
the diabolical expressions began to appear in your work. He, and I say the delicious character because other cartoonists I've talked to, such as Duncan McPherson and Mosher.
Right, Terry.
Terry Mosher. I'll say that, gee, you know, he's a godsend. He's got this rather diabolical look about him.
That's right, the great nose and everything else.
Right.
And I used to enjoy drawing him, not at first. I had a hard time getting onto him. And then finally, something clicked. I found that when I drew Pierre Trudeau, whenever I did his eyes, rather than make the whites of his eyes white, I'd make them dark, and the darks of his eyes white, and then I sort of got that look, you know, that I was after. And it sort of came across. I came across it one day by accident, so I always drew him that way from then on.
Were there any mentors for you?
Oh, I think the person I guess had the most influence was Duncan. He, I guess way back, encouraged me to get into political cartooning as well, and he saw me struggling along. And I guess I always thought if I wanted to be a cartoonist, that's the style I'd like to draw in, and that's the type of cartooning I'd like to do.
We're talking about Duncan McPherson, and I think we should pause here and say, for whatever reason, we have this almost embarrassment of riches in political cartooning in Canada. We were marked down a few years ago in Peter Deborah's book,
Right.
The Hecklers.
The Hecklers, right.
We got
Great
so
book.
many, and they're so good when you
We
look around the
do.
world.
Well, the funny thing is, there are 26 or 27 of us now working full-time in Canada. We formed an association of Canadian cartoonists because they're going to be opening, hopefully, a cartoon museum in Ottawa,
Great
which will
idea.
be nice, on political cartoons. And we sort of got together as a group to try and help out with that. But when you go across the board, right across the country, from Peterson in Vancouver all the way to Todd in New Brunswick, they're all different. Their styles are all different. They draw a different type of cartoon. Even the French Canadian cartoonists draw in a different style again. Whereas we look at the Americans, they're all clones of Oliphant or McNally. Not all of them. I shouldn't say all of them. Most of them are good friends of mine. But there's always that running feud down there amongst them, that they're very critical of each other's work because they do copy one another, in style anyway, and even in substance, I guess, too.
I want to talk about the process because you face a daily deadline and
A blank sheet of paper.
blank sheet of paper. This is exactly what we got in front of us here. Well, let's look. Here is a cartoon from The Sun recently, at a time when the Prime Minister was facing an ordeal every day.
Taking a lot of heat in the house.
Taking a lot of heat. Here he is, and in contrast to Pierre Trudeau, I think Mulrooney is a bit of a challenge. He's a little harder to draw.
Well, he is, but he has that jaw, and you can almost, he's at the point now where you can just draw the jaw and everybody knows it's Mulrooney. Ben Wicks loves him, I mean.
I looked at that. Terry Mosher did one with a brassiere.
It's right.
He's slung in a brassiere. Okay, now this one captures what has been happening in the past 24 hours in Parliament. That's your challenge. You've got to do something that's artistically good and reflects what's happened, and it has to be in the hands of the editor at a certain hour, I suspect.
Right.
That puts a lot of pressure on you. How do you deal with that?
It does, at times. Sometimes you get, I've always said, as long as there's, good political news coming out, you can usually come up with something. When you get earthquakes and floods and that type of thing is the big news, and there's not much political thing, it's a grind. You have to go back, and when you have a really good story going, like this one, Mulroney being hammered in the house every day, regardless of what it's about, everybody's aware of it. They've seen it on television, they read it in the papers, they're aware of it. So you can draw something without any words or anything, and everybody gets it immediately. When you have to dig down and start putting a lot of words in, that's what ruins the cartoon sometimes.
Okay, the technique itself, there are a lot of figures in this thing. Where do you start? And maybe you could show us.
Well, all I can do is a rough, what I probably did on that one, just as a sketch. If I hold it up this way, can they get that on the camera, right? Is I start out with a square, or not a square, but a rectangle. And just in the planning of it, I drew, I would basically just draw this. I knew I wanted Joe down in the corner. I had the desks in.
This is Joe Clark,
and I wanted,
whom you always show with a pair of gloves.
Brian up in here. And then it was just a matter of filling in the spaces with Mazinkowski down here, and I think I had Pat Carney up behind him. And it was a matter of just filling in all these, to get enough heads in there. And I think I had Crosby up behind him as well somewhere. He doesn't sit there, but I had him back up there. And that's how it starts. And
as fast as that?
Yeah, and then it's the next step is doing the final one, which of course you draw in with pencil very carefully and then ink it in and put the tone on after.
How long does that take?
That one took about 3 hours, I guess, 2.5, 3 hours, something like that.
And you have to, is there an hour of the day you work? Pick your time of the day you work?
No, not really, because if I get the idea at 9 o'clock, I can be home by noon, which I can't be, but I like to think I can. I would say that the majority of the time that I'm actually drawing is probably between 2 and 5. It sometimes takes me, now that I'm getting on later in life, it takes me about 5 hours to come up with an idea. You sometimes get several ideas and you try to decide which is the better one to go with. Or you think of an idea, but you can't get the line to go with it. And you keep, as a matter of fact, you do several of these sort of doodles on it.
Do you have to be in isolation for this? What do you do?
Yeah,
Sit back
pretty
and
well. Yeah,
listen to some music and draw?
No, I sometimes have the radio on, trying to pick up any late news, but usually
we won't ask
the
you
phones,
on which station. But
the phones are ringing all the time and that type of thing. When that happens, I go up to the cafeteria and have a cup of coffee, or I lock myself in the washroom where nobody bothers me. You know.
You also do, and I want to talk about this before we leave the air. There's another side to Andy Donato. There's beautiful landscape paintings you do of the East Coast, particularly.
Uh-huh.
You have this thing about Newfoundland.
Oh, I love Newfoundland.
Mists
yeah.
and waters and boats and things like that. Has that always been there, or is that something that's come along?
It started, believe it, at the same time as the cartooning. When I lost the job at the Telly after the 3-month trial, I was so down. I decided I had to turn my attention, my mind going and my mind off the cartooning. And I began to paint seriously for the first time in my life. I used to diddle with paints and fool around with them. And then the two sort of took off. The painting took off in one direction and the cartooning in another. And I'm still doing the same thing now. My last show was all in Italy. I went to Italy for the first time in my life, and I was so knocked out by it that I did a whole show on Italy. I've done one on Newfoundland. My next show is going to be a mixture of, I think, New York, London, Italy, and wherever else I go. Europe really appeals to me.
It's got to be a very satisfying life. I want to talk about the sun for just a moment, and this strange thing that has happened, and perhaps it's not fair to ask you this, but we had all those years of Trudeau bashing, as you would say. We had a guest on the program a few weeks ago who said it was all in vain because he never read the paper.
That's right.
But nevertheless, that was the feeling of it. Now we've got Mr. Mulrooney in the target, in the crosshairs.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Is that going to be sort of the flavor of the paper from now on? Whoever is at bat is going to be targeted?
I think, no, I don't think they'll be targeted. I think when they do wrong things or they're not running the government properly, they're always going to be targets. And I think that Brian, I guess, I don't think anybody expected him to be quite a disaster. I was saying just recently, the funny thing about it is it's crazy. You've got an economy that's booming along quite well. The interest rates are down, inflation's down, everything's going great, as opposed to when Trudeau was in, it was all the other way. And we were bashing Trudeau, but here's a prime minister that, for some reason, they don't like him. I mean, everybody seems to be down on him. He's getting, mind you, he's getting caught in some pretty shifty scandals in Quebec and whatnot. But that's, like, as you know, that's Quebec politics. They think nothing of it down there.
I'm not even going to say it.
Little land deals here and there. You know?
Andy can say that.
But it's interesting, and I guess the thing with Brian, as opposed to Trudeau never read the papers, Brian does, and he gets really offended by, I know, by cartoonists in particular.
That must make your day.
It does in a way, you know. At least you know he's paying attention. But you're right, Pierre, although mind you, I did meet him once, and he did know who I was when I met Pierre a few years ago. But Brian is I think he really would have loved to have the media on his side all the time, and they've really turned on him now. It's going to be interesting to see how he survives all this, if he survives.
We'll wait for that one. Our guest this week, Andy Donato, the cartoonist, the political cartoonist, the Toronto Sun, whose work is known to everyone, and I've been kind of glad to have him on this program to show that he doesn't eat glass for breakfast after all. Decent guy. I'm Pete McGarvey. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next week with another guest.
Innes, Riley, and McGarvey was produced at the North York studios of Rogers Cable 10, Toronto.